Welcome everyone to the Raleigh Regional Association of Realtors, the Color of Law Advocacy Forum. My name is Brett Bushnell and I'm the 2021 RRAR President. On behalf of our association, I want to express how excited we are to be hosting this forum with author Richard Rothstein as a collaboration between the NC Homeowners Alliance, RRAR's Government Policies and Issues, and Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Committees. The North Carolina Homeowners Alliance is the only statewide organization fighting for homeownership at the General Assembly, and we are tremendously grateful for their partnership today. I'd also like to thank the Homeowners Alliance staff liaison, Catherine Went, for helping to make this webinar possible. We're joined this morning by Corinne Bowman, RRAR's 2021 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Chair. Corinne will be moderating our discussion at the end of this webinar. If you have any questions during Richard's presentation, please utilize the Q&A feature. Corinne will get as many questions as possible answered and slotted with the allowable time with Mr. Rothstein. Thank you, Corinne, for your leadership and for serving as our moderator this morning. RRAR's incoming Government and Policies and Issues Committee Chair, Tim Mock, is also joining us today. Tim will be introducing our keynote speaker for this webinar. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brett. And thank you again to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. I have the distinct honor of introducing our guest of honor this afternoon, Richard Rothstein. Richard Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, published in May 2017. A distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the Haas Institute at the University of California at Berkeley. Mr. Rothstein is also the author of Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right, 2008, and Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap, 2004, The Way We Were, Myths and Realities of America's Student Achievement, 1998, The Charter School Dust-Up, Examining the Evidence on Enrollment and Achievement, co-authored in 2005, and All Else Equal, Are Public and Private Schools Different, co-authored in 2003. Richard, I'm honored to present you and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to engage in this conversation with you. I'm very glad to be here, and I look forward to a stimulating exchange after I make an initial presentation. As you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools back in the 1930s, and then went on to challenge segregation of colleges and universities. And then in 1954, as you all know, that civil rights movement persuaded the Supreme Court to prohibit legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Supreme Court decision gave emphasis, inspiration, motivation to a movement of activists who engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives in that struggle. Some were very severely injured. I'm sure many of you remember just a year or so ago, we commemorated the life of John Lewis, who was severely injured simply for trying to lead a march to get the right to vote. Well, in the course of the next 15 years or so, through the 1960s, that civil rights movement pretty much persuaded much of the country, and surely you know, not everybody, but persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, and that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. And with that understanding, that civil rights movement, with its demonstrations, its civil disobedience, marches, succeeded in ending the segregation of public accommodations of restaurants. In North Carolina, the sit-ins in Greensboro led that way, ended the segregation of public transportation, the buses, ended segregation in employment in many cases. And then in the 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed. that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But then, surprisingly, the civil rights movement ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them, including North Carolina. And every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas, are either all white or mostly white. Clearly defined areas are either all black or mostly black. How could it be? If we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society, that we still tolerate living in an apartheid residential system? Well, partly it's because undoing residential segregation, once we've created it, is hard. You can pass an ordinance prohibiting future segregation in restaurants. The next day you go to any restaurant you want. But you pass an ordinance prohibiting segregation in neighborhoods, and the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans, is we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for not doing something about the apartheid conditions under which we live, the segregation of neighborhoods in every metropolitan area of this country. And the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of restaurants or buses or schools and colleges, that was all done by government. If the state government was doing it or local government was doing it, that was a violation of the 14th Amendment, a civil rights violation. And we know that if there's a civil rights violation, a violation of the Constitution, all of us as American citizens have an obligation to do something about it. If the federal government was doing it, for example, requiring segregation of trains when they cross the Mason-Dixon line, that was a Fifth Amendment violation, a violation of the Constitution, a civil rights violation. And we also, as American citizens, have an obligation to do something about that. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government, wasn't required by law, by regulation, by public policy. That sort of happened naturally, happened by accident. It happened maybe because private homeowners or landlords refused to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it happened because private businesses, banks, realtors, developers discriminated in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's, just because blacks and whites, we like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just an economic thing. African Americans have lower incomes than whites on average, not everybody, but on average. And so African Americans typically can't afford to move to white neighborhoods. All of these individual bigoted private sector actions, self-choice, economic trends is what we say cause segregation. And we tell ourselves if it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. If it happened naturally, it can only unhappen naturally. Well, you just heard a long list of books I've written. You probably realize, in listening to that almost all of them were about education policy, not about housing. That's what I was writing about and studying prior to getting to this book, The Color of Law. And in the 1990s and 2000s, some of you are old enough to remember that. In the 1990s and 2000s, I spent a lot of time writing about a national education policy that I thought was ridiculous. We had a national consensus across the political spectrum that the reason that African American children achieved at lower levels than white children on average, we called it an achievement gap. And the cause of this achievement gap was that teachers of Black children were lazy. They had low expectations. They just didn't try very hard to teach Black children. And if only we could force teachers to try harder, we called it to raise their expectations, to get rid of low expectations. If only we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I know it sounds ridiculous. I thought it was ridiculous at the time, but we actually passed a law incorporating this theory. The No Child Left Behind law that was adopted in 2001 required children to be tested every year, required that the scores be reported by race, with the theory that if teachers saw that their Black children were achieving at lower levels than white children, they would be ashamed and they would try harder. This is what the law required and what it predicted. It predicted that within 7 years, only by reporting test scores by race and getting teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. Well, it's 20 years later, the achievement gap is just about the same as it was in 2001. Of course, there are some lazy teachers. There are some lazy people in every profession. There are some lazy realtors, I imagine. But lazy teachers is not the reason why we have an achievement gap. The reason we have an achievement gap is because so many African-American children living in low-income segregated neighborhoods have social and economic disadvantages that impede their ability to take advantage of what even the best hardworking teachers have to offer. And I wrote column after column about this. I was the education columnist at the New York Times. And I wrote columns about this, explaining why Black children didn't achieve at the same levels of white children. I remember writing one column about asthma. Do you know that African-American children have asthma at a much higher rate than white children? They have asthma at a higher rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods. There are more trucks driving by their homes. More vermin in the environment, more dilapidated buildings, more empty lots kicking up dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who does not. Not in every case, I only talk about averages, but is more likely than a child who does not to come to school a bit drowsy because that child's been up at night wheezing. And if you have two groups of children who are identical in every respect, even the same racial composition of each group, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement by a very small amount. This is not a big cause of the achievement gap. But then you begin to think of all of the other social and economic disadvantages that Black children in segregated neighborhoods come to school with. Lead poisoning. Do you know that African-American children have lead poisoning at a higher rate than white children do? Lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ. It depresses IQ. African-American children have more lead poisoning because they live in older buildings where the paint had lead in it and the paint is flaking off. Or they live in homes where the water is being delivered in pipes that still have lead. They're still made of lead that haven't been replaced. African-American children have had lead poisoning at a higher rate. And this also depresses achievement by a small amount. And then begin to think of the other things: homelessness, economic insecurity, less adequate access to medical care. One of the books you heard described before, the Class in Schools I published in 2004, some critics made fun of it. They said this was the toothache theory of schools. But African-American children have less access to dental care, are more likely to come to school with toothaches and therefore be distracted and have lower achievement for that reason as well. All of these make a tiny bit of difference, but you add them all up and they've pretty much explained the achievement gap. There's not much less to explain by lazy teachers. Well, this is what I was thinking about, and I gradually began to realize it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity, but what happens if every child in a school has one or more of these challenges? How can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come healthy, well-rested, well-nourished from economically secure homes? You can't have that expectation, no matter how many laws you pass decreeing it. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children like that, we call them segregated schools. And schools today, believe it or not, are more segregated than they have been at any time in this country in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was an educational problem. I still wasn't thinking about housing. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision about education. That's what I was reading about at the time. The Supreme Court evaluated two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of them had trivial school desegregation plans. They allowed parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to intensify segregation, that choice wouldn't be favored in favor of the choice of a child who would not intensify it. So if you had an all-white, a mostly white school, and a black and a white child both applied for the last remaining place, the black child would be given some preference. A very, very trivial desegregation plan. You don't have one place left in the school very often, and you have to choose between a black and a white child. But the Supreme Court denounced the program. Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the opinion, said you couldn't do such a thing. It was unconstitutional, he said. He agreed that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated. He agreed that they were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. But he said the neighborhoods were segregated de facto, without government involvement. And if they were segregated without government involvement, it's not a civil rights violation, and government is prohibited from doing something to fix it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered something I read in some years before about Louisville, Kentucky, one of those two school districts. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. That homeowner had an African-American friend who lived in the center city of Louisville. That African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife and a child. He wanted to move to a single family home, but nobody would sell him one. So this white homeowner in this all-white suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop it. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the courts, the criminal justice system, these are agents of state government. There's a 14th Amendment violation here. We have an obligation as American citizens to remedy it. We've never accepted that obligation, never undertook to remedy it. And then I looked into it further, and I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of cases of police protected, sometimes police organized and led violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods in the 20th century. Every one of these, and I'm not exaggerating when I talk about hundreds in numbers, every one of these was a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment. They occurred all over the country, in North Carolina, in New York, in Chicago, in Detroit, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, every one of them. A blatant civil rights violation that we, all of us, have never undertaken the obligation to remedy. And then I began to look into it further, and I found it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that created the racial boundaries that we have today, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, all racially explicit, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. So let me, in a few minutes that I have with you today, describe maybe one or two, if I have time, of the most powerful federal policies that ensured racial segregation. Perhaps the most powerful was a policy pursued by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the immediate post-World War II period to suburbanize the entire white population into single-family homes in all-white suburbs like the one I described in Louisville, and prohibit African Americans from doing the same. This was a racially explicit policy, and it succeeded in creating the white nooses around every metropolitan area that we still experience today. They were so powerful, they experienced the racial boundaries. They predict the racial boundaries of today. You're familiar with this program. You may not be aware, though, that in the 20th century, early and mid 20th century, most whites, as well as African Americans, lived in urban areas, aside from those living in rural areas and agriculture. But those who were not were living in urban areas, not in suburbs. The reason was we were a manufacturing economy at that time. There was no internet, none of this internet stuff, we were making things. And factories needed to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. So workers, both black and white, who were working in those factory districts had to live close enough to be able to walk to work, maybe take short streetcar rides. The banks and the other service industries that were serving that manufacturing economy also had to be located close to the factories. So we had downtown areas with both black and whites, middle class and working class families. Some of those areas were integrated, much more than we would ever imagine or ever have seen today. Not all, but many were. The federal government embarked on a program to suburbanize the whites who were living in those urban areas and prohibit African Americans from participating as well. And you know these suburbs, they exist in every metropolitan area in the country. The most famous of them is east of New York City, Levittown. I assume you've heard of that. It was 17,000 homes in a rural area east of New York, an enormous project. The builder, William Levitt, wanted to do this. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to build 17,000 homes, for which he had no buyers yet. The banks thought this was a crazy idea. The only way Levitt could get the funds to buy the land and build these homes was to go to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submit his plans for the development, the architectural design of the homes, the materials he was going to use, and a federally required commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This went on all over the country. I mentioned Levittown because it's well known, but it exists around the Triangle. It exists around Charlotte, where I used to live. It exists in every metropolitan area, these suburbs. This was not the action. These requirements of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working in these departments. This was the policy of the federal government, written in a federal policy manual that was called the Underwriting Manual. It was it was sent out to members of your industry, appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not to recommend for federal bank guarantees, proposals of developers of new subdivisions in suburban areas around the country. The manual said you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a subdivision that was going to include African Americans in a white subdivision. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because the manual said, and I'm quoting, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the written federal policy manual said. Again, this notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. This is a blatantly unconstitutional system of residential concentrations that we have in this country. Every one of these subdivisions that was financed by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the post-World War II period is a constitutional affront, a civil rights violation that we have never remedied, that we have an obligation, all of us, blacks and whites, to remedy. Well, this particular policy, and as I say, there are many, many of these policies. I describe many of them in my book, The Color of Law. I don't have time to describe many of them now, but this particular one had enormous impact and still is felt today. The homes at that time in all over the country, in New York and on the West Coast and the Midwest and the South, were inexpensive. They cost maybe $7,000–8,000 at the time. That's about $100,000 in today's money. Anybody, black or white, with a job in the post-war economy could afford to buy a home for $100,000 with an amortized 30-year mortgage from the FHA or VA if they were returning war veterans, black or white. No down payment was required. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this affordable program. Well, those homes no longer sell, as you know, for $100,000. You can't find one for sale for $100,000 today. You're not selling homes for $100,000 in these suburban neighborhoods. Well, they sell, depending on the part of the country, for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some parts of the country, $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes gained wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes over the next couple of generations, from the equity that they gained from appreciating homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used that wealth to take care of temporary emergencies, maybe temporary unemployment or medical emergencies. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by official federal policy from participating in this wealth generating exercise program. If they had temporary unemployment, their income was permanently reduced. And for generations, that temporary unemployment pushed them further down the economic scale. No wealth to take care of it. Today, African American incomes are about 60% family incomes of white family incomes. There's a whole story of the unconstitutional policies that depressed incomes as well. You'll have to invite me back to tell you that story sometime. I don't have time today. But you'd think that if African Americans had family incomes, they were about 60% of white incomes. African American family wealth would also be about 60% of white wealth. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, while African American incomes are 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is now about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity, which affects your industry so desperately, that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that has never been remedied, that we've never accepted an obligation to remedy. And that determines much of the racial inequality today. I described earlier how it determines to a large extent the achievement gap in schools, because so many African American children come from families without wealth who can't afford to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods where they wouldn't suffer the assaults I described. It determines health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, in part because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods, less access to markets selling fresh food. It determines the police abuse, the mass incarceration of young African American men. I'm not suggesting that no police officer would ever abuse anybody if it weren't for racial segregation. But when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods, where they have no access to good jobs in the formal economy, no access to the transportation to get to those jobs, no access to schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their children, it's inevitable that the police are going to engage in confrontations with them and develop the kinds of tactics that are used to control restive disadvantaged populations all over the world. If you compare the tactics of American police in segregated low-income neighborhoods, they're quite similar to the tactics that were used by the English in India or the Belgians in the Congo. This is a necessary consequence of segregation. And the segregation that we created with this policy, as well as many others, also has another impact, which is very, very frightening and dangerous. I can't overestimate how frightening it is, and that's the political polarization that we have in this country today. That's greater than any time since the 1850s that led to the Civil War. And that political polarization isn't entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines, as we all know. And how can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences? How can we develop a common national identity on that basis? Well, that's just one of the policies that the federal government followed to create segregation. I think I have time maybe to mention briefly one other before we go to questions, and that's public housing, something that we all misunderstand. We think public housing is a place for poor people, lots of single mothers with children, lots of those young men without jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country, and the poor were not permitted into public housing. It began in the Depression, during the New Deal, in the Roosevelt administration. The public housing was built not for the poor. We had a 25% unemployment rate during the Depression of the 1930s. Public housing wasn't for that 25%. It was for the 75% who had good jobs and stable incomes and who could afford to pay the full cost of the housing in their rent. Public housing was built, the first public housing was built in this country for people who had good jobs, but who couldn't find housing because during the Depression, there was no construction going on, or very little construction going on. There's a big housing shortage. So the federal government built public housing, and everywhere it built it, it segregated it, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Separate projects for African Americans, separate projects for whites from the very beginning of public housing. I mentioned before that in the 1930s and 40s, whites as well as African Americans were living in urban areas if they weren't in agriculture, not in suburbs. In my book, The Color of Law, I describe the great African American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes. I hope most of you have heard of him. In his autobiography, he describes how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood, Cleveland, Ohio. We don't think of downtown Cleveland, Ohio now as an integrated place. But he says his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. This was an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency that built public housing, went into that neighborhood and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation. With that and other projects elsewhere in Cleveland that were also segregated, that persists to this day. In my book, The Color of Law, if you've read it, you may recall that where I can, I like to pick on self-satisfied, smug places that think they're better than Raleigh. One of them I write about is Cambridge, Massachusetts. Maybe you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood in the 1930s, was an integrated neighborhood. Blacks and whites in an integrated neighborhood. The federal government went to that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate public housing projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. And with other projects elsewhere in the city, and in Boston generally, created a segregated pattern that we know today. The whites in all of those projects that I've described, and those segregated white projects, were eventually moved out by the program I talked about before, the suburbanization of the white population. So eventually, African Americans became the only residents of public housing, mostly in urban areas in this country. Eventually, the formerly white projects were opened up to African Americans. As jobs disappeared and highways were built so that the factories could move out to the suburban areas where the whites were now living, African Americans became poorer and poorer. Eventually, public housing had to be subsidized, and we have the kind of public housing that we know today. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. The policy writers or journalists like me write about them all the time. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to be as aggressive and determined as the civil rights movement of the 1960s, when it addresses this bastion, this last remaining bastion of segregation, which is neighborhood segregation. The policies, I say, are well known. I'll give you one example that you will say is very far-fetched. You'll think it's ridiculous, and it is ridiculous because we have no political support for it now. We need a new civil rights movement that's going to make it imperative. But think of those suburbs that I created, that I described before, whether it's Shively outside Louisville or Levittown outside New York. As I said, those homes sold for $100,000, affordable to African Americans, but prohibited to them. Now selling for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. Levittown, for example, is now 1% to 2% African American. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 said to African Americans, okay, you can now live in Levittown. We're not going to stop you anymore. And there are a few African Americans who can afford to buy homes for $300,000, $400,000, but not many. Levittown is located in a broader area that's about 12 to 15% African American. The federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown as they come for sale at market rates, $300,000, $400,000, and reselling them at deeply discounted rates to African Americans until the population of Levittown achieves the 12 to 15% of Black share that you would expect if it weren't for the policy of exclusion that the federal government created. We know the banks, the developers, the real estate agencies that contributed to the segregation of these suburbs all over the country. They can be identified. I wrote a column, an article rather, in the New York Times about a year and a half ago, in which I described one all-white suburb of San Francisco, and I described the small bank that financed the segregation of that suburb, but it's now been absorbed by Wells Fargo. I described the small real estate agency that was commissioned to sell the homes in this segregated neighborhood. It's now been absorbed by Coldwell Banker. And the developer of that segregated neighborhood with restrictive covenants on every home still exists in that community. Well, that bank, Wells Fargo, that realtor, Coldwell Banker, and that developer, when they absorbed their predecessors, they didn't just take responsibility for the financial assets and liabilities of their predecessors. They absorbed the moral liabilities as well. And they have an obligation as well as the federal government to redress the segregation with substantial subsidies for African Americans to move into a community that's now completely unaffordable to them. And the same kind of research about the bank, the realtor, the developer that created segregation in your community is also possible to be done. And those successor institutions also should step up to redress it. If you like, I don't know if you send out, Tim, after this webinar, if you send out an email to registrants, but I can send you a link to that article and as well as some other material that I've developed as I write a new book on what we should do to redress racial segregation. I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders who are in the process of creating something they call a new movement to redress racial segregation. And they plan not to focus on federal policy, but to focus on the kinds of local activities that local citizens in their both professional and private capacities can undertake to redress segregation. They plan, I think, to launch it in the new year, sometime in early 2022. And again, I can give you a link to their website so that anybody who's interested in learning about this new effort can get the information to do so. With that, I think my time is up, and I would like to take as many questions as we have time for, and hopefully give answers that will satisfy you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Wow, Richard. I don't even know what to say, right? It's so insightful. Your words, your wisdom, your insight, but the body of work that you have done in the research and studies, and somebody who's read your book a couple of times, and having this really thought-provoked conversation right now and then hearing directly from you, it's mind-boggling. It really makes you wonder, what can I do to help be part of the solution and not the problem, right? Especially in our industry.
Well, I'm determined to try to help you figure that out.
Yeah, so we do have several questions for you. For sake of time, we're just going to ask a few. And so here's the first question we have for you, Richard. Your body of work has been beyond impressive, especially surrounding race, education, and economic policy. What has inspired you to embark on this journey, and how has this journey have a major impact on your personal life?
Well, I'll answer the first part first. I'm 78 years old. I should be retired. This is interfering with my retirement. I've got to stop it. I want to finish this next book so I can relax. The next book is about what we could do to redress segregation. But what inspired me to do this? Well, I gave you a couple of hints to it about my interest in education policy, my career in education policy, and how I realized that neighborhood segregation is what was harming our young people and their achievement. But I guess I'll answer it also. Nobody writes a book without having an idea that they're going to come up with something. And so let me describe some personal experiences I had. When I was a very young man, in the 1960s, I had a job as a research assistant at the Chicago Urban League. And at that time, the Chicago Urban League was participating in a lawsuit against the Chicago Housing Authority, the Chicago City Council, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which had just been created. And that lawsuit charged that the Chicago Housing Authority and City Council had deliberately segregated Chicago by placing housing projects for whites in white neighborhoods and for blacks in black neighborhoods. I described that earlier. And my job, I was a young kid. There was a book written about this lawsuit, and they described me as the leader of the Jeans Brigade. I was a young kid, and my job was to go to the basement of the Robert Taylor Homes, which was a giant housing project, a high-rise project in Chicago, all black, very dysfunctional. Go to the basement of the Robert Taylor Homes and go through all the correspondence of the Chicago Housing Authority that demonstrated that it was deliberately segregating the public housing in Chicago. When I say go through all the correspondence, I'm talking about historical correspondence going back to the 1930s. I'm not that old. That wasn't current correspondence. That was still old correspondence by then. So this lawsuit was eventually successful. It's the title of the lawsuit, for any of you who are familiar with the law at all, it was called Gautreaux, Gautreaux, after Dorothy Gautreaux, who was the lead plaintiff, an African-American woman who was living in a segregated black project. That lawsuit was eventually reached a settlement where residents of public housing were given vouchers. It was the first voucher program to find better housing and higher opportunity neighborhoods. So I tell you that experience from when I was in my early 20s, or mid 20s, I guess, to show what was in the back of my mind, why I realized I was going to come up with something when I heard all this talk about de facto segregation. I realized that might not have been the whole truth.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's really insightful. as you talk about just your personal experiences and how it's impacted you, we also look at it from a realtor perspective, right? We're in this industry, we're working this industry every single day. And we know that we've also, our industry played a part in this, right? You talk a lot about that in the book. We discussed a little bit about that today. What are some of the things that you feel that we can do as industry leaders, as realtors, that can create more solutions to building a more fair and equitable opportunity for our industry and for the communities in which we serve?
Well, the first thing I think that realtors need to do is observe the Fair Housing Act. I'm sure you're all familiar with the expose that Long Island Newsday did. Well, Newsday, I guess it's no longer called Long Island Newsday. Newsday did in Long Island in 2019, in which they had paired testers wearing hidden cameras, buttonhole cameras, and they documented. You can see it all on the web if you go to that Newsday article. And I'm sure you're familiar with it, but if not, Cora and I can send you a link to that article as well, which includes links to the videos that they actually took, showing the way that realtors today in New York continue to steer white families to white neighborhoods and Black families to Black neighborhoods. This is a very, very small part of what you can do. I'm sure you're a great real estate realtor agency, and a federation association. But I don't hope you won't feel insulted if I say that if this is going on in New York, it's probably going on in Raleigh as well. And cleaning that up is the first step that you can take, and it may be commissioning an independent agency to do paired testing of your own realtors, to see if this is still going on in your agency. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I spend a lot of time talking to the National Association of Realtors, and I tell them they are giving you overly conservative and wrong-headed advice about how to observe the Fair Housing Act. What the National Association of Realtors is telling you is never mention race. Pretend it doesn't exist, just like the Supreme Court. It doesn't, there's no, race doesn't exist anymore. Everybody is the same. That's not what the Fair Housing Act requires. What the Fair Housing Act requires is for you to steer people to diverse neighborhoods, to steer them away from segregated neighborhoods, to be conscious about what you're doing, to explain to parents that their children will get a better education if they go to school with a diverse student population, as they'll learn how to function in the 21st century, where the workplaces they go to are going to be diverse. That's something that the National Association of Realtors is afraid to advise you to do, but you have an obligation to do it. So those are two things. The third thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, is that I think that the major real estate agencies, and even some of the minor ones, have an obligation to make financial contributions to support the home ownership opportunities for African Americans who, because of the real estate industry's past practices, excuse me, do not now have the wealth to be able to afford the kinds of homes that they should be able to afford. So I think the first two things I mentioned are things that are within the actual obligations under the Fair Housing Act of the real estate industry to do. The third thing I mentioned is an obligation I think you have as American citizens to participate in the redress of racial segregation.
I love that. I love that. We have the fiduciary responsibility to making sure that we uphold the honor of our job. And it's not necessarily the transaction, but it's serving our community at a high level, right? But then you also said, put your money, put your money where your mouth is. Back it up, because we realize that we've created this problem. When I say we, just the industry itself, we talk about the historic data. It's just plain facts, right? It's facts. And so now we really have to make sure that we continue to find solutions, ideas, processes, but put it to action. So I thank you so much for that. On those same lines, let me ask you this, Richard. Do you see any current housing or zoning related policies that are going to have negative impacts on equitable access to housing in the future, especially considering the rise of home prices across the country? Because we all know that the prices are rising really fast, and that also helps widen that gap.
Yes, well, you stated it. There's not much I have to add to the smart statement you just made, Corin, but I will say this. Once you have two unequal populations, blacks and whites, who are in different social and economic circumstances, race-neutral policies will have a different impact on those blacks and whites. And many times those impacts can be racially discriminatory. So the policies can be discriminatory in effect, even though they're not discriminatory in intent. And I'll give you one example from your own industry. It's something that you interact with all the time. As you know, it is more difficult for African Americans to get mortgages than it is for whites. Our mortgage system is racially discriminatory. For example, and you know this, I'm sure, as well as I do, probably better because your experience. When a bank evaluates you or for a mortgage, or evaluates one of your clients for a mortgage, they look at their credit scores. They look at scores that are provided by the credit scoring agencies. As you know, the kinds of credit that those agencies consider are the kinds of credit disproportionately that whites have and that the African Americans don't have. So, for example, if you, today, white families, 70% of white families roughly own their own homes. 40% of African Americans own their own homes, roughly speaking. It's a big difference. That means that if an African American and a white are applying for a mortgage, the white applicant is more likely to have previous mortgage payments counted towards their credit score, but the black applicant is less likely to have previous mortgage payments, is more likely to have rental payments, and that is not counted towards the credit score. So you have two families, both of whom are equally faithful in paying their debts, in making their monthly payments for their housing. The white family who's making the payments through a mortgage payment, the black family who's making its payments through a rental payment. The white family will be approved for a mortgage. The black family will not, for that very reason. Now, because of the enormous attention devoted to this particular problem, Fannie Mae has just announced a new policy where they will allow black homeowners, black applicants rather, to gather the material that's necessary to prove that they've paid their rent on time. White applicants don't have to gather the material to prove that they made their mortgage payments on time. The mortgage company simply send it to the credit scoring agency. So it's still a racially discriminatory system. When you have a client who is applying for a mortgage, I think you should find ways, and this is not my position to say, but I'm saying it anyway. You asked the question. I think you should be dealing with banks to make sure that they are overriding the algorithms that they're given so that African American applicants can qualify for mortgages that they should be able to qualify for. So that's just one example of something that you can do about a policy that, as I say, has disparate impact, even though it's not racially discriminatory.
I love that. I love that. And so my last question I do want to ask here, because we're getting on time, is, let's see here. We have one question. This is from the chat. Can you share any real estate related policies or regulations that you believe still maintains disparities and segregation, but presents itself as beneficial to homeowners or the creation of home ownership?
Well, Corin, I think I've answered that. I'll give you one specific one though, and that is I alluded to this before, and that is the real estate. One of the reasons I mentioned before that we're more segregated today than we have been at any time in the last 45 years. One of the reasons is that the real estate industry is using test scores of schools as a proxy for indicating the quality of a neighborhood. The result is that neighborhoods are becoming much more homogeneous racially than they ever have been before. Now, we know, and you when in the introduction, my past work was described, I wrote a book called Grading Education, Grading, about that described how test scores do not indicate the quality of a school. All they indicate is the educational level of the parents, because children whose parents are highly educated get high test scores regardless of the quality of the school. So by using test scores as a proxy for neighborhood quality, what the real estate industry is doing is steering, even without being the kind of steering that a fair housing testing program can discover, is effectively steering highly educated parents to other highly educated parents' neighborhoods and not to high quality neighborhoods. So that's one thing that the real estate agency industry can do. As I said, I think you have an obligation to steer applicants, Black and white, to non-segregated neighborhoods, to diverse neighborhoods.
That's it. I love it. Thank you so much, Richard. Again, guys, this is Richard Rothstein, New York Times bestseller, The Color of Law. If you do not have this book, please get this book today. You can go to Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. It's an amazing book, great insight. I wish we had more time, Richard, because I could sit here and talk to you all day long because you have a wealth of knowledge. And so again, thank you so much for your time. And before that, I just also want to thank some others as well. And so right now, we would like to take this opportunity before we end this program. We want to share some exciting news with you guys. We actually at the Raleigh Regional Association, a part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, we just released our Diversity Alliance Pledge and Toolkit. This toolkit is an opportunity for us to do something really major in our industry. We are pleased to announce this launch of our toolkit to help better serve our associates, our industry, and in communities in which we serve. This initiative will help implement a comprehensive approach that will foster a standard of diversity, access, equity, and inclusion. Through this step, we will begin by breaking down systemic issues that we just discussed today with Richard Rothstein. And we will also talk about the issues we currently face still today with fair housing, home ownership, when we look at our home ownership gaps, our deficiency of leadership, as well as the wealth gaps and socioeconomic problems that currently still exist. When it comes to people of color, individuals in marginalized communities, we realize that there's still some work to be done. In our industry, our association, we are taking a stance. Our goal is to promote and educate, as well as empower associates and firms, along with impressive DEI through resources, education, and best practices. I want you guys to definitely take a look at our pledge. Please visit our website at www.rrar.com. And in that, I would like to just take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you guys for joining us today. This was an amazing 1 p.m. session on us coming together as a community to figure out what we can do to create equitable solutions in our industry, in our neighborhoods, in our families, so we can be better. I also would like to give a huge thank you to NC Realtors and the North Carolina Homeowners Alliance, North Carolina Homeowners Alliance, for helping making this event happen. I also like to thank you guys. Again, Richard, You've provided so much historic insights and knowledge. We humbly thank you. We would love to have you back with us. You will be hearing from us. We want to know more. And guys, he's actually writing his next book. So there is a part 2 to The Color of Law. So we're so excited. Continue the work that you're doing, Richard, because it empowers us to be better. And again, thank you all for your attendance. It's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.